Hello, I'm Dr. William Schlosser. This is my classroom.
Go ahead and introduce this great guest speaker today. Tholen Blasko was a student in this classroom in 2019. And oh golly, he came on, asked me if I'd be his advisor for his honors thesis. We did it, and we just have been working together ever since then. He's now a master's student, working in this great location with the hatchery here on campus, which still, Tholen, boggles my mind. But this is exactly where we step into and what we do. Tholen's going to introduce a lot of great stuff for you. With that, welcome to the classroom. Welcome back, former TA.
Thanks. It's pretty cool to be here. Like Dr. Bill said, I can't believe it's been 4 years since we met, and yeah, we've been really doing some cool stuff working together ever since. So thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here and spend an hour talking about salmon with you guys. You know, pretty small class size today, so I really hope we can have an interactive talk today. And obviously, you know, salmon are an amazing species. We get to live in a state that supports salmon, and I'm really excited to talk about it with you today. So who here is at least in some way interested in salmon? Most people. Who here is potentially interested in pursuing a career in fisheries or salmon in some way? Roy, I know Roy, a few people. So I thought at least we'd start today by talking about, what does a career in fisheries look like? I know you're all here in the Natural Resource Ecology class. Obviously, ecology is all intertwined. But I think, at least for what I do, I think it's important to talk about how to get into fisheries. So fisheries is a pretty complicated career path, and it's well known that no two fisheries careers are alike. So I kind of boiled it down into three simple steps. So the first step is kind of where you all are now, pursuing a bachelor's degree, maybe getting some volunteering experience, maybe doing some internships or working in temporary positions, maybe pursuing some undergraduate research. Kind of all of the aspects of step one are included in kind of building a resume, building some sort of conglomerate of experiences that make you a competitive candidate for the fisheries world. And then also, obviously, we're mostly talking about hatcheries today. A hatchery is a great way to get into working in the fisheries industry. Hatchery positions are usually longer as far as their duration. They have great benefits, and most of the time they provide housing. So hatchery is definitely a pathway into a fisheries career. So step two is just kind of taking another step forward. Maybe this is going to graduate school or working some of the longer tech or temporary positions. I think it's important to always keep volunteering during your time in fisheries with nonprofits and doing stream restoration and that kind of thing on the side, as well as hopefully continuing to do research, finding ways to keep improving the salmon populations in our state. And then kind of the step three is where you've kind of made it. You know who you are as a fisheries researcher and as an environmental advocate. You can start to choose your agencies you're applying for based on the ones that match your values. Hopefully you find that rare fisheries permanent position, as well as continuing to volunteer, pursue research, and I think really important, mentoring the next generation of fisheries biologists. So I wanted to talk about, how did I fall into the three-step program that I made up. I got my bachelor's from WSU a few years ago, and worked with Dr. Bill on my honors thesis, which he has linked on the Canvas page. SOE 300 was one of the classes that I credit for kind of sparking my interest in fisheries. I also met Dr. Michael Phelps in the Department of Animal Sciences when I was an undergrad, and was able to perform some undergraduate research through him. After I graduated, I went to work for the Snohomish County Department of Conservation and Natural Resources in a 3-month internship, which is pretty common. Just built a lot of skills here, a lot of kind of surveying skills, technical skills, did a lot of networking, which allowed me to transfer over to the Department of Fish and Wildlife, where I worked for about 6 months, performing creel and stream surveys. When that position ended, I came back to WSU as a research technician in the Phelps lab, and then I started my graduate studies this past fall. So I'm still kind of in step two. So in this presentation today, we're going to get into kind of some nitty-gritty stuff about hatcheries. You know, we're going to talk about Artifishal. Hopefully everybody has been able to watch it. We're going to kind of get into the landscape of salmon recovery, which is very political. It's a lot of economics involved, a lot of different stakeholders are involved. So I kind of wanted to break that up a little bit with a few fish stories from working in the field. So this first one, those of you who know Dr. Bill by now probably know his affinity for lampreys. So I wanted to start with a lamprey story. In one of my previous positions, I worked to form a bathymetric map of the North Fork Stillaguamish River. And during one of our surveys, we were watching ospreys and bald eagles fish for the Chinook that were migrating. And while I was rowing down, I had a lamprey dropped on my head from what I assume was an osprey. You can see down in this lower picture here, it had a kind of a grab mark from where it was picked out of the water. So this was my first time ever really seeing a lamprey in the wild. I had heard about them a lot from Dr. Bill, but I'd never got to hold one before. Obviously, it was dead by the time I got to see it. But it's a lesson learned. You never really know what's going to happen when you're out in the field. So you always got to be ready for anything. So I want to jump into artificial now. Before we really get into it, does anybody have any initial thoughts or initial questions, initial reactions to watching the documentary that they'd like to share? What everybody think? Was it a little jarring to see that? Or did it kind of, some people thought it was intense. Some people might have been expecting to see some of that. Yeah, it's definitely an intense documentary. It's very emotive, and there's a lot of things to jump into. So I want to start with kind of a review of terms. So today when we talk about Pacific salmon, we're just talking about the 5 species found in Washington. So Chinook, coho, chum, sockeye, and pink salmon. When we talk about steelhead, we're just talking about anadromous rainbow trout. So anadromous is a fish that has grown up in freshwater, migrates out to saltwater, spends most of its life before returning to freshwater to spawn. Whereas when we talk about rainbow trout, this is the same species. They just are staying in the lake or the river, and they never see the ocean. You might remember from the documentary, they talked about Atlantic salmon and brown trout. So this is a different group of species. They're in the Salmo group. And so all of these kind of salmon, I want to talk about more of their life history versus their life cycle. We're probably all familiar with the salmon life cycle: egg, alevin, fry, par, smolt, out to the ocean and back. But I want to get us thinking about what is the life history of salmon today. I've put a couple of examples up here of life history, which is essentially, if you look at a fish, what happened in that fish's life? What is the history of that fish's life? And so I've put kind of a famous life history example, which is the stream type and the ocean type Chinook salmon. So in the same population of Chinook salmon, you have different life history strategies. So you might look at Chinook in a river system, take one out, and imagine if you could read its history, you could see the stream type Chinook emerged from their eggs, spent a year growing in the stream, even over a year growing in the stream before they began their ocean migration. Whereas ocean type Chinook, they emerge from their eggs in the gravel, and they pretty much within a few months travel to the ocean right away. I think it's important to be thinking about these life history strategies, and we'll really get into why that's an important part of talking about hatcheries and salmon recovery. Evolutionary significant units is how fish in the state of Washington are divided into different managements. So even sometimes the same species needs to be managed differently depending on their life history. And there's over 30 different officially recognized ESUs in the state of Washington. Then I want to just kind of review some of the hatchery terminology from the film before we get into it. So conservation hatcheries are the hatcheries that are there to, their mandate is to provide salmon for a river, from a conservation basis, to supplement struggling wild populations. Whereas mitigation hatcheries are put in place because there is some sort of inhibitory factor that has to be paid for in a mitigation. So for example, maybe a dam has been put in place. Now the runners of the dam have to pay for a hatchery to try to mitigate the loss of salmon because of the dam. Recreation hatcheries are more so growing recreation species such as trout to stock into lakes. And then research hatcheries are fish that will probably never see the wild, fish that are just used in studies. And so as we're imagining all these different these salmon's life histories, I want us to really think about how fish interact within their community. So for this presentation today, we'll define a Lotic fish community as a group of co-adapted species with similar geographic distribution. And Lotic means running water. So we're really focusing on river systems today. These fish communities are highly sensitive and easily affected by both biological and physical factors. So you can imagine how they would be affected by nutrient cycling, interactions with invasive species, sunlight, maybe landslides, different natural events. And then community diversity. So how many species are present in these communities are higher in unconstrained reaches. So I have a picture here of two different kind of reaches of a river. You can see this example B here. You have a river, you have a floodplain, you have riparian buffers. This river is unconstrained, it can move around. Whereas this river has kind of a natural canyon. This river cannot move around. So we would expect the diversity of the fish communities in this river to be higher than here. And so what I want us to be thinking about is, while this is a natural example with a canyon, in what ways do hatcheries constrain fish communities? Do we expect there to be a diversity in a community in a hatchery? Which is kind of this rule I wanted to point, where habitat diversity can lead to community diversity. And so if there's a lack of habitat diversity, there will be a lack of community diversity. And lastly, there's kind of this biological rule that a population density in a fish community decreases when habitat is reduced or simplified. So again, thinking about a wild example, we have a very complex, diverse habitat. Here in this example, this river can change flow, it can change direction, it can fill the floodplain. But what is the habitat like in a hatchery? Is that a reduced or simplified habitat? These are things I want us to be thinking about as we get into it. So bringing this into recovering salmon, because that's where we are right now. Most salmon populations are in need of recovery. So we've kind of broken this down, especially in the state of Washington. This 4-H model is used by salmon managers to kind of break down the different areas for salmon recovery. So first we have harvest, both commercial and recreational harvest plays into how salmon are recovered. We have habitat, like we were talking about. What is the quality of habitat available to these salmon? We have hatcheries, which is our big one for today. How do hatcheries impact salmon runs? And we have hydropower. So is hydropower impacting salmon? Hydropower is definitely a renewable energy, but when it comes to salmon, is it actually a clean energy? So one of the first examples I wanted to bring out from the film is the Skykomish River. Obviously, this is a river. This is the river I grew up on. It's close to my heart, and I was excited when it was one of the first examples brought up in the documentary. So does anybody remember what was said about the Skykomish River in the documentary? Does anybody remember what was said and want to say? That's okay. I know it's a long documentary. So that essentially someone was being interviewed and they were saying, you know, I don't really understand why the salmon populations have declined on the Skykomish River. There's great habitat. There's no dams. There's not really many people fishing on the river, so it's got to be the hatcheries, right? And so I wanted to have this slide to provide some context for, as we get into the impact that hatcheries have on salmon. It's really important to remember that salmon recovery and the impacts on salmon are so complex and intricate, and there's so many factors impacting salmon that while it's really good to focus on each individual factor like hatchery and hydropower and the harvest and the habitat, it's important to always keep them in mind all together. So as far as what's really happening on the Skykomish River, at the time that the documentary was released, there were 3 dams, 3 major dams, even more, there's more minor dams, but we have these 3 dams here. 2 of them have actually been removed in the last couple of years since the documentary came out. There's been good recolonization results. There's also the Skykomish is a pretty heavily pressured river as far as retention fishery seasons. There's not great habitat in the Skykomish River. Most of the lower section of the river is paralleled by the railroad and major highways. The river has pretty much been channelized, so it's been straightened, and it parallels where a lot of cars are always driving out of Seattle. And as we know from research that WSU is involved with, we've kind of figured out that car tire chemicals that can leach into the environment can actually inhibit the reproductive ability of salmon. So there's a lot more going on in the Skykomish system besides hatcheries, but there are 3 major hatcheries in the system that, on top of everything else, really exacerbate the issue of salmon recovery. So we have a famous steelhead hatchery, Reeder Ponds, the Wallace River, where I worked for a time, and Sunset Falls, which is kind of a satellite location for the 2. And these hatcheries combined produce millions of salmon into the river every year. And actually, I was just reading a study that there are some managers that surveyed the genetics of the steelhead in the river and found that pretty much the hatchery steelhead have outcompeted the wild and native steelhead. The hatchery steelhead initially came from Columbia River broodstock and were put into this river that they were not adapted for. And because of that, they've completely almost outcompeted the native steelhead to the point where the native steelhead are nearly extinct. So there's kind of two line of thoughts presented in Artifishal for hatcheries. Are they a solution or are they a band-aid for salmon recovery issues? So I put this example from the film to kind of highlight how mitigation hatcheries are formed. You had this John C. Boyle Dam put up in California. And because this cut off most of the spawning habitat for salmon in the river, this Coleman National Fish Hatchery was formed so that they could pump a lot of salmon into the river below the dam. So I want you guys to start thinking about what do you think is this a solution for salmon recovery, or is this just a band-aid? So we're kind of getting into the hard stuff now. So I wanted to kind of step back for a second and tell my second fish story. This was must have been 2 falls ago now. Like Dr. Bill said, I'm getting old. And I was working for the Department of Fish and Wildlife, but I was also trying to get back into graduate school. So I was helping Michael Phelps from the Animal Sciences Department with his field surveys on the weekends. So this is a Puget Sound tributary that we were working on. We were collecting pink salmon for a student in the lab that is running a pink salmon study. And we were surveying pretty late. We were trying to get as many samples as we could. And as it started to get dark, it became obvious that there was someone else on the creek that did not want us there sampling his fish. And so pretty aggressive black bear started to kind of tell us to get out of there in his own way. And thankfully, we were able to get out of there safely. But it's a good reminder to always be ready when you're out in the field, because you never know what you're going to run into. And also a good lesson that maybe the best way to get into graduate school is to get chased by a black bear with your professor. So as we are thinking about hatcheries, we're thinking about their impacts on salmon, we're thinking about Lotic fish communities, I want to introduce this idea of the portfolio effect. This is kind of the name given to life history strategy variation in Pacific salmon. We are here in the Pacific coastal ecoregion, which, if you remember from the beginning of this class, it's one of the youngest ecoregions. There's been a lot of activity that has impacted salmon relatively recently with the glacial Lake Missoula, a lot of tectonic activity. Salmon have to have a way to survive these type of events. And with what we know historically, it's pretty impressive that salmon have been able to keep such high populations with some of these really disastrous ecological events. So they do this through their life history diversity. If you think about it, we talked about stream type and ocean type Chinook. Let's imagine a scenario where you have your ocean type Chinook hatching and swimming out. They stop in the estuary to rear and to eat. Maybe there's some sort of disaster. Maybe there's some sort of oil spill that kills all of those Chinook. Well, thankfully, they have this diversity where those stream type Chinook will be coming out a year later, and salmon are designed to replace themselves. Those stream type Chinook can replace that population and even give birth to the ocean type Chinook because of this life history diversity strategy. And that's why it's called the portfolio effect. Because if you imagine an investment portfolio, you want to have a diverse group of investments. You want to have stocks, bonds, real estate, a whole bunch of different investments so that if one crashes, the other ones can keep you stable. So that's exactly what salmon display with the salmon portfolio effect in their diversity and their habitat requirements, their behavior, This is going to be really interesting to study as we get further and further into climate change, and just the variation within the richness of the different evolutionary significant units. The natural environment allows salmon to have these diverse portfolios. And so I want us to be thinking about, if these salmon are raised in what Dr. Bill calls a concrete sarcophagus, does that allow for a diverse portfolio of salmon, and a diverse portfolio of populations in case of negative events? The other thing that we've been really seeing with Pacific salmon is their size. So historically, through natural selection evolution, salmon grew to be very large. The river system that Dr. Bill and I worked on, the Elwha, historically the Chinook salmon were famous for returning over 100 pounds. And there's many different factors that kind of influence the size of these salmon. But if you go to that same river today, the largest salmon you might see in a return might be 30, 35 pounds. So why are salmon becoming so much smaller? Well, there's a few things going into play. We have commercial harvest. If you think about natural selection, what size of fish is most likely to be caught if you are netting fish? Probably the bigger fish are going to get more easier caught in a net. You have increased predation. Structures like dams and locks allow predators of salmon to more easily target them, like seals and sea lions. But really, you have this every year, millions and millions of salmon being reared in hatcheries. If we think about natural selection, what size of fish is selected for in a hatchery? You think about a concrete raceway. Is a big fish gonna thrive in a secluded or a really secluded, really small environment? It's some people argue that maybe salmon are devolving in size. We also have this issue of pre-spawn mortality, which is salmon that successfully return to the river from the ocean, but for an unknown reason die before they're able to spawn. I put this picture here from when I was a surveyor on the Skykomish River. The Chinook season that I worked, we had almost 50% of our Chinook females die before they could spawn, and this is pretty common with a lot of salmon rivers today. The other thing I want to point out about this picture is these are female Chinook salmon, and these are some of the smallest Chinook salmon I've ever seen. They're all clipped hatchery fish, and they're all about 8 to 10 pounds, which is a pretty sad state for Chinook salmon. So when talking about salmon dying early, when talking about salmon becoming smaller, I want to call back to the earlier slide about habitat, where population density, so the number of fish, decreases when habitat is reduced or simplified. And when we think about the habitat that these fish were reared in hatcheries, and also the habitat they experience when swimming out of the river and coming back, it starts to kind of make sense why we have less salmon and why we have smaller salmon. So let's dive into some actual examples. So this is a hatchery, a nearby hatchery that I went to with Dr. Bill's equipment to collect some video. What are some of your observations for the habitat? There's salmon growing up here, yeah. Yeah, so they're basically growing up in a lake, right? This is not a river environment. You have very lentic conditions, very homogenized conditions. If you imagine these salmon growing up needing the experience to prepare them for the real world, what kind of experiences are they getting here? We'll get into this later, but you can kind of see on the top here, you have a big net right here. They really aren't facing any pressure. So let's kind of juxtapose this. Here's a video I took from the North Fork Stillaguamish River. This is an area with a high density of juvenile salmonids. So what's the difference here? What are these fish experiencing that fish in a hatchery might not be? Yeah. Exactly. So natural oxygenization. Yeah. I think the raceways are anywhere from 3 to 4 feet deep. Yeah. So here, like he was saying, there's a variety of depths here. There's a diversity of habitat. The habitat is unconstrained. These fish have to learn how to swim through turbid riffles, how to survive in pools where other species might be present. There's a lot of different stuff going on here that these fish have to experience. How about physical environment? So here's a video from the same hatchery, their younger areas. What do you guys notice here that may be different from the wild? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. They're surrounded by, in this case, metal walls. And even their entire building, they have a roof over their head with giant lights on. They may not be experiencing a natural circadian rhythm. They're not experiencing variation of weather. They're completely protected. These fish are living in darkness the whole time here in the corner, while the rest that are out are in constant light. And as we move on, we'll talk about this more, but what about the interaction? I mean, you just have thousands of your own species that you're interacting with. So let's juxtapose that to, this is a river that's about 45 minutes from Pullman that I like to fish. Imagine though that same group of steelhead. This is a major site for steelhead spawning. What are the steelhead getting here that they're not getting in the previous video? Yeah. Exactly. So they have different weather. They have night and day. They have large woody debris. They've got a lot of diversity in the different types of habitat they can occupy. A lot of people have, I've heard some people say, is the natural environment capable of producing the same number of fish that a hatchery can in the same amount of space, right? So in hatcheries produce millions of fish in a very little amount of water. So I wanted to show this video from when I worked for Department of Fish and Wildlife. This is a small tributary in the Snohomish Basin. And this is a survey I did where we surveyed all 5 species of Pacific salmon at one time. And you can just see in this small creek, there are But so nature is capable, if you give it the right area, nature is capable of producing millions and millions of salmon. This is a pretty remote location, so you don't have development, you don't have roads, you have some invasive plants here you can see on the right, but you have big adult carcasses feeding. So when these juveniles emerge and they're feeding, they can feed on actual adults like it's meant to be, rather than just some sort of food formula. So nature is capable of producing fish. We just have to allow it to do that. How about predators? So here's another video from the hatchery. This is also an area that's under a roof. What's kind of some of the behavior that you witness in this video that might be, yeah. Exactly. So that's a good point. These fish are fed at the surface, so they're going to be hanging out towards the surface. You can even see some of these guys are curious about the camera. So here's a foreign object in their environment, and what do? They swim up, and even some of them actually attack it, which was pretty funny. But if you think about that for when these fish are put into the wild, it seems like we're kind of producing generations of salmon that are ill-equipped to survive in the wild. These fish aren't scared at all of me. They're not scared at all of the camera. Here's a large foreign object in their environment, and they're just acting pretty normal. So this might be kind of tough to see, but what do you think would happen to these guys in a situation like this? I'll zoom in a bit, but maybe some of you can see what's going on here. What do you think would happen if this guy came in and those fish are so curious about foreign objects, they're swimming right up to this guy. He's going to have a pretty good lunch that day. So it's just kind of this continuing idea of, our hatcheries producing if hatcheries are meant to replace wild salmon with hatchery salmon, are they producing fish that are detrimental to the environment, or are they producing fish that can actually handle replacing wild salmon? So I want to talk about the interaction between species. So this is a big group of steelhead, and they're pretty much like we've talked about. They're only interacting with each other. They are literally seeing no other species. The only thing that they are learning, if we think about nature versus nurture here, the nurture that these fish are getting are just interactions with each other. They have no context for other species. They have no context for predators. They have no context for what they should be feeding on, because they just are feeding on the food that's given to them every day. So my video to kind of show the opposite of that is tough to see. Hopefully we'll get it going here. I filmed this in another Snohomish Basin tributary. And so this is a kind of an example of what these fish would be experiencing in the wild. So these are chum salmon spawning, and it's a little, I'll skip ahead a little bit. It's a little blurry, but kind of what I was getting at is eventually, and it's tough to see right now, but eventually in this video, you see a few different species all interacting. So you see these chum salmon interacting with each other, kind of competing for space and resources, competing for mates. But at the same time, in different spots in this video, you also see other species. You see mountain whitefish that are waiting for these fish to spawn so they can eat the eggs. You see bull trout that are also waiting to eat the eggs, but really the bull trout wait till the fish emerge from the gravel so that they can eat the fry. And so these fish are going to really undergo a lot more intense selection than fish raised in a hatchery, because they're going to have to escape predators. They're going to have to fight for resources. They're going to have to interact with other juveniles from other Pacific salmon. So you can see this environment here is much more intense, much more of a steep learning curve to prepare fish for their ocean migrations than they might be experiencing in a hatchery. So I'll move on just for the sake of time, but it is a fun video to watch. So kind of moving on a little bit to some of the other negative impacts of not necessarily hatcheries as we know them, but other ways that fish are cultured. The documentary brings up the Cypress Island net pen escape. And so the net pens are run by Cook Aquaculture. They had a failure in this net pen where over 250,000 Atlantic salmon escaped and made it into the Puget Sound. So Atlantic salmon are obviously non-native to the Puget Sound, so this presents a major issue for the environment and habitat. Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife didn't really have a plan in place for what to do. They didn't expect these net pens to break, so when it happened, their only really response was to say, all right, if you're a fisherman, please go catch as many of these salmon as you can. And so that kind of worked, but not really. Luckily, it was kind of uncovered that most of these fish were sterile fish, but still that's an entire generation of 250,000 Atlantic salmon utilizing resources that would be going to Pacific salmon. So you can see that there's global implications to this kind of culture. A lot of fish are cultured in areas where they're non-native. So I put this picture here. I was lucky enough to go do some fish stuff in Iceland last May. I got to fish this beautiful river to catch wild brown trout and Atlantic salmon. But the guide said, if I was to come back in the fall, this river would be packed with invasive Pacific salmon, pink salmon. And these are pink salmon that have escaped from fish farms in the Atlantic Ocean. So it's kind of this interesting aquaculture scenario where why are we raising Atlantic salmon in the Pacific and Pacific salmon in the Atlantic? It's kind of a thing that the documentary brings up that's a pretty big issue. We see that when Pacific salmon invade new habitats, they actually display new life histories. So as we're aware, Pacific salmon are semelparous, meaning that after they spawn, they die. But researchers in New Zealand have started to see that areas of New Zealand that are now occupied by Chinook salmon, in some cases, those Chinook salmon are spawning and continuing to survive to swim back out to the ocean. So there's kind of a lot of implications on the global scale for hatcheries and aquaculture introducing invasive species to different areas. And there's really not many solutions. Kind of sterility is kind of one solution. That seems to be the only major effort that's happening. So lastly, the documentary brings up the political power of hatcheries. Does anybody remember what was said regarding the politics of hatcheries? That's okay. It's a hot topic, so I understand not maybe wanting to talk about it. So my question to you is, after watching Artifishal, I would just want you to be thinking about how can the establishment of hatcheries be used as a political and economic tool. We see that mathematician or the economist in the documentary kind of break down the numbers about how expensive a single steelhead was that returned to the Methow basin. And so how much money is being funneled into hatcheries to produce a fish that is impacting native and wild Pacific salmon. So I want to know your final thoughts. You know, you've all seen the documentary now. We've kind of dove into kind of the biology behind hatcheries, maybe a little bit more of the why behind why hatcheries can be detrimental to Pacific salmon. So yeah, if anybody has any kind of thoughts that they're thinking or anything they want to share, I would love to know. Yeah. That's a great point. I think hopefully more and more people will realize that. So I think Oregon passed a law that Atlantic salmon aren't allowed to be cultured in Oregon. I think Washington passed actually a total net pen ban that's I think still going through some litigation, but hopefully I think Washington either has or is working on passing a no Atlantic salmon ruling. But yeah, it's a great point. You read about Norway is a big one. Norway is completely being invaded by Pacific salmon. And it's just an interesting idea to, you know, I am an advocate for aquaculture in some instances for as far as it being a solution to world hunger, but I think we need to be smarter about how we go about producing fish for human consumption. So I wanted to kind of highlight some of the main points. We talked about how hatchery fish are impacting wild salmon and how the discrepancy in their rearing kind of really plays into that. But I also want to talk about, we've talked a lot about rearing today. I want to talk about now the adult stage. How do adult hatchery salmon affect the wild salmon? I think it's really common to see hatchery fish out competing wild salmon, as usually hatchery fish are bred to be a little bit bigger, a little bit stronger. Like the example from the Skykomish River, where the native steelhead have pretty much genetically gone extinct. The wild fish are really impacted by the hatchery fish. And we've talked about hazardous marine net pens. And we touched on that and maybe some of the solutions going forward. We've talked about the cost of raising fish. I don't remember the exact number, but it was $60,000 or $70,000 per returning adult steelhead. That's a high cost to the taxpayers per fish. I don't think a lot of people really understand that that's the cost of these state hatcheries, as well as the cultural implications. As some of you probably know, in the treaty agreements that we've made with the indigenous tribes, one of the promises was that they would have access to their historical numbers of salmon. And I was recently attending a talk where one of the speakers said that that promise in the treaty has actually never been met even since the treaty was signed. And so we definitely need to work on recovering these salmon populations so that we can meet the agreements that are made in these treaties. So I put this picture here because last fall we got to do a big salmon release into the Spokane River, the first time in 100 years that salmon were in the Spokane River. And it was a really powerful event to be a part of to help release fish back into that system. And then thinking back to the Skykomish, it's always good to, excuse me. It's always good to watch these kind of documentaries with a curious, a learning attitude, but also with a critical eye to kind of see some of the ways that it's easy to simplify salmon recovery and the plight of salmon when really it is a complex and an issue with a lot of factors contributing. So for the sake of time, I'm going to go through this quick. I just wanted to talk about how research hatcheries are used. So some of the cool fish that are emerging now from research hatcheries are brook trout that have that are diploid with YY gametes, meaning that we can kind of alter brook trout so that instead of being XY males, they'll be YY males. This is really important for conservation as brook trout are invasive to the Pacific Northwest. If you think about it, the only offspring possible if a female mates with a YY male is a male. So the thought is if we introduce YY males to these areas where brook trout are invasive, eventually after a few generations, hopefully we'll get that one generation where the entire population will be all males, and then they'll eventually die out. So that's kind of a management tool. We have sterile fish such as tiger trout and tiger muskie, which are hybrids that cannot reproduce. You can introduce these species into areas with invasive fish to try to eat them, and then after one generation they're gone. They are not at risk of becoming invasive species. You can make rainbow trout sterile through triploidy, which is another way to alter the gametes. So instead of an XY male, you have an XXY male. However, the process of making triploid males has only about a 95% success rate. So there is a little bit of a chance for invasives there. My lab's working with CRISPR to try to genetically manipulate a few genes to make sterile fish. That's kind of an exciting frontier there. And so research hatcheries really contribute to conservation and recreational fisheries. Speaking of that, I want to introduce you to our research hatchery. This is a little video I took of one of our little tanks. But we do have a large facility here on campus where we raise fish for research purposes. I don't think a lot of people know about our large hatchery on campus. So Dr. Bill and I and our lab's hatchery manager have set up 4 tours for next week that you can sign up for on Canvas. So Dr. Bill will be putting a sign up on Canvas. So the tours will go next week every day, Monday through Thursday. And then each tour will be about an hour. So from 3 to 4 p.m. is when it works for our hatchery manager to give these tours. So I really encourage you. I invite you guys to come to these tours to see the big hatchery, see what we're doing, see some cool fish, some genetically engineered fish. And if you're interested in fish, to see what we're doing on campus. This would also be a good time if you're interested in working in the hatchery. Usually we're pretty much always hiring. So it's a great way to have a very flexible side job while you're on campus. So we have a couple minutes. I want to end with my last fish story. When I first came to WSU as a undergrad, freshman, sophomore, I didn't have much time, but the free time I had, I was fishing this Spring Valley Reservoir a lot in Idaho. It's a good place to with really easy fishing to catch a lot of fish. And one morning I was out there and I was really interested in learning more about wolves from Dr. Bill's class. And I just happened to be out there when this is not a picture I took. I didn't get a picture, but I was really lucky to be out there when a small wolf pack ran through. I had a friend who was fishing on this dock right here. I was a little bit worried about him because I was in a boat on the lake, but they left him alone. I got to see him run for about 100, 150 yards before they ran back up into the woods. So really cool to see wildlife, and there's some great places to see wildlife close to Pullman.
Tholen, I'm sorry, was that your friend running or the wolves running?
My friend was probably going to be swimming if they ran it. But no, he was definitely freaked out. But man, I had never seen a wolf in the wild before. They're so much bigger than I imagined. They're just really beautiful. And then lastly, I want to pitch this event that my lab is putting on. So April 29th is a Saturday. Be a good way to take a break if you're studying for finals. We're putting on this Hope for Salmon kind of cultural event where you'll be able to eat salmon, We have some amazing keynote speakers coming from the Nez Perce tribe to talk about the cultural history of salmon. It will just be a big event at Reaney Park in Pullman from 12 to 5, where we will be celebrating salmon, celebrating the research that WSU is doing for salmon, as well as the work that the Nez Perce is doing. So we're really excited about this and really hope to see you there. So with the couple minutes we have left, I'll take questions about anything, whether it's, yeah. So I think the idea now, I mean, obviously science is always evolving, right? So originally when these hatcheries were built, the science was, let's take the biggest and strongest fish from wherever that is in the state and put them into these rivers. So at the time, that the biggest and strongest steelhead was the Skamania steelhead from the Columbia River. So they brought in all those Columbia River fish, and they put them in the Skykomish. And so what happens is, right, so they outcompete the native and wild steelhead in Skykomish, but they're almost different species genetically, that you can tell them apart genetically. And so technically it's an invasive species, right? Maybe they do better in that environment, but usually invasive species do better in the environment than native species. And so you have essentially what is then a genetic extinction. And so nowadays the science is more so focused on keeping native populations established. So what they'll do is, instead of taking strong fish from the Columbia, they'll just take what's known as native brood stock. So they'll collect the native fish that are swimming up the river and breed them in the hatchery instead of taking fish from other places. So yeah, I hope does that answer your question? Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. I'm a big advocate of removing those species. So I've been working on a couple projects to like make it so that there's no bass limit like on the Snake River. I think that I'm more of an advocate of removing invasive species like bass than I am of like the pike minnow reward program, because the pike minnow are a native species. But I think, because of the habitat that's there at the Snake River, those of you who have been down there know that it's at least above Lower Granite Dam, it's called Lower Granite Lake because it really is more of a still water environment. It's a great environment for crappie, bluegill, bass, and a lot of those fish species eat juvenile salmonids. So I think it's really important to either figure out a way to make that habitat unsuitable again for those invasive species, or incentivize recreational anglers to take as many of those species out of the river as they can. So yeah, I'm definitely a supporter of removing those species. Yeah. Yeah, so my entire project is with eDNA. And so, yeah, there's some great eDNA work on campus. If you are familiar with the field, one of the pioneers of eDNA is a professor at WSU, Karen Goldberg. Yeah. So the Goldberg lab takes a lot of eDNA samples from our hatchery. I've taken eDNA samples. Actually, I've had Roy along when I've done eDNA before. So yeah, there's some great eDNA work on campus. And if you're interested in it, definitely shoot me an email and we can get you involved. Awesome. Well, I think that's my time. So I really appreciate everybody. Thanks, Dr. Bill.
It's fantastic. And I will be putting up the calendar event if you guys want to get over there next week. I'm going to have 4 different times you can get in there, see what's happening in that fish hatchery here on campus, which totally still blows my mind. But wonderful things are lined up. Thank you so much for coming in, Tholen. It's a great time.
Yeah.